Total of 294 miles, but with sidings and spurs, there was a total of 300 miles of track. This was the longest narrow gauge in the United States at the time. Unfortunately, on July 12th, by that time the price of silver had fallen, and it was decided by all the CNC directors and officials to make a 2-day inspection run over the road. Now, Darius Mills, he preferred the comforts of San Francisco. He had been out on the road a couple of times on minor excursions, but this was the first, not only 1-night, 2-night, 3-night, 4-night journey on the narrow gauge. Now, you have to remember, it's July, it's hot, and the coaches only have what is known as 2640 air conditioning. Now, for some of you that are looking at me funny, wondering what 2640 air conditioning is, that is 26 windows in the coach up doing 40 miles an hour. Upon arrival at Hawley, we got off of the coach, and William Sharon came straight to the point and asked Mr. Mills what he thought of his new railroad. You have to remember that the only thing Darius Mills has seen for the last 2 days is 300 miles of sand, sagebrush, and jackrabbits. He gets off the coach, and Mr. Sharon asks that question. Darius Mills looks around this desolate, God-forsaken landscape. He reaches down and he picks up a handful of sand, looks at it, lets it run through his fingers, dusts his hands off, looks Mr. Sharon square in the eye and says, "Gentlemen, we have either built this railroad 300 miles too long or 300 years too soon." Turned around, got back on the coach. That was about the end of it. Now, in the days of the Carson, Colorado, it wasn't always on time. As General Superintendent, I understood some of the problems. Unfortunately, in the summer, it was customary for some of the train crews, upon leaving Hawthorne headed north, there was a spot where the track curved a little in a cut, and the crew would stop and go take a refreshing dip in Walker Lake. Now, if they had no passengers, I wouldn't have minded. But this time they forgot that they had one passenger. And it wouldn't be just any passenger, but it has to be a female passenger. And not just any female passenger, no. It has to be Mrs. Jack Campbell. Mrs. Campbell was married to Mr. Jack Campbell, who was the newspaper editor of the Hawthorne Bulletin. Hawthorne, being the division point, is also where Robert James Laws resided, my assistant and construction superintendent. Well, what happened was the train stopped, the crew had gone about on their foray, and Mrs. Campbell was left to sit there in the coach wondering what the devil was going on. Well, of course, being a woman and the curious creature she was, she had to get up from the coach and go forward. Nobody there. Went back to the back coach. No one there. Carefully descends off the coach, goes up to the locomotive. No one in the cab. Goes around the front. Nobody on the other side. And in the distance, she hears voices. Oh, okay. Well, the track curves around, and through a cut, she decided to go investigate. Well, she came around the corner, and she literally caught the crew with their pants down. She saw them, they did not see her. Being the proper lady she was, she beat a hasty retreat back to her seat in the coach and pretended nothing had happened. The crew was none the wiser. Unfortunately, of course, about a week later when she returned, she told her husband all about what happened. The following week, there was a scathing editorial in the Hawthorne newspaper about the lack of decorum upon the Carson, Colorado Railroad. Now, you could just imagine the paper boy delivering the paper to Mr. Laws in the morning, and Mr. Laws sitting there, and he reads this editorial. Next thing you know, who is he telegraphing? Me. In my office in Carson City, saying, "Mr. Yerington, sir, we have an issue that I need to speak with you as quickly as possible, but privately." All right, what is going on? You're coming up, I take it. Okay. He arrived, brought the newspaper. Now, I'm normally a calm, cool, collected man, but I am human. I did lose my temper when I read the report. I can't help it if they heard me from my office clear down to the stone fort over a block away. Needless to say, horrified management quickly made a new rule. Now, down in the Owens Valley, in 1885, Mr. Sharon had passed away. That left sole control of the Carson and Colorado to Darius Mills. The Owens Valley agriculture was just starting to pick up, but they hadn't quite gotten there yet. Now, in 1893, I went down there to talk to Mr. Craig of the Inyo Index, and they had offered us 300 tons of wheat. We only got 30 to ship, and such wheat. I was, growing wheat myself. I would have been ashamed to try to sell the stuff, and I told them so. Well, needless to say, that went over kind of like a lead balloon. The railroad had been built on the east side of the valley because of all the mines, and all the towns are on the west side. And the people had always and never forgiven the railroad for not building on the west side. So the profits were never quite as good, and our stranglehold like we had on the V&T was not quite as good. And the profits weren't as good. So in 1900, along comes the Southern Pacific Railroad and offers Darius Mills $2.75 million for his 300-mile narrow gauge to nowhere. He gladly takes the money. He goes back to New York, happy to get rid of his white elephant. One little problem. The ink is hardly dry on the transfer papers when a fellow by the name of James Butler, out in the middle of nowhere, gets mad at his mule, picks up a rock to throw at the mule, and just as he's about to let the rock fly, he has high-grade silver ore. The Tonopah boom has been born, and the Southern Pacific now builds a 3-foot narrow-gauge feeder line from Tonopah Junction down to Tonopah. That was the bad news that for us, because obviously we didn't own the Carson and Colorado Railroad. There was a silver lining, though. You see, Southern Pacific didn't have any other connection to its home rails but one. Over the Virginia and Truckee Railroad, which we controlled and which I was still vice president and general superintendent. Now, to give you an idea of the amount of traffic from the Tonopah boom, cars were backed from Reno clear into Sparks, waiting to get in over the narrow gauge. We were running 40 to 50 trains a day over the Virginia and Truckee Railroad. And then somebody in San Francisco finally got smart and said to their bosses, why are we paying Mills and the V&T when we can come here to Hazen on our main line, build down to Fort Churchill, build standard gauge all the way down into Tonopah, and we'll bypass the V&T altogether. And that is what they did. They built standard gauge all the way down to Tonopah. They standard gauged from Fort Churchill up here through Mound House. And basically, now we were just reduced to a little feeder line and tourist traffic. On November 25th, 1910, I was called home to be with the Lord. I was 82 years old. The railroad, Mr. Mills would soon perish soon after. The V&T would go to his great-grandson, who had run it until the 1930s, and that would finally be abandoned. Today you have, here in historic Dayton, many buildings and structures, one of which is the Carson and Colorado Railroad Depot. And I, Henry Yerington, want you to help restore it. Restoration and preservation are the keys to your heritage. And I thank you all for your time.
Well, I'll get up here where Mort can hear me. Okay. I'm sure Mr. Yerington would be happy to answer questions. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I understand that he has to return to his less accessible mode of being dead somewhere. So if you have questions for Mr. Yerington, this is your opportunity to ask them. So I'll let you go on, and looks like we have someone.
Yes, ma'am.
Why did you order the rails from England? They were making rails in...
The problem with American rail was they had not perfected the process. We had ordered some from America, Chicago in fact, used on the Virginia and Truckee. Problem was with that rail, it had a tendency over time to crystallize very rapidly. It was actually cheaper and better quality to get the rail from England. It wouldn't be until almost 1900 before they perfected the steel rolling for rail here in the United States. Yes.
And repeat the
I understand, sir, that you talk about the Candelaria as being a new engine. You also contacted some people about new cars. Of all of those purchases, how many were new, and how much was the used equipment, knowing that you were cheap?
How much was the equipment, whether it was new or used, and me cheap? Me?
Frugal, Mr. Yerington.
Sweet little guilty, all right, I mean innocent me. No, all the equipment on the Carson and Colorado Railroad was brand new. The 440 locomotives cost $9,250 each. The Lamothe boxcars were very reasonable at about $475 complete. Now the Lamothe cars, although new, they had gas pipe frames with wood and then sheet metal over the top. They were good cars. The only problem was over time they would rattle themselves apart. And they were in the shop in Carson City more than they were out on the road. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Yerington, does my memory fail me, or did you have some dealings as far as administration with Mint in Carson City, or am I in error?
Dealings with the Mint in Carson City, not in so much in administration, but mainly we did have dealings, but that was more of Mr. Mills, Mr. Ralston, and Mr. Sharon being with the Bank of California. My main thing was I was a lobbyist in the Nevada State Legislature, and I was involved in some 40 enterprises during the course of my life, and I was an officer of some form or other in at least 16 of them.
One more question,
Mm-hmm.
please. With whom did you contract to build your home in Carson City?
That home was built when we bought it in 1869 for the cost of $1,200.
A beautiful home.
Thank you.
A lovely home.
Yes, sir.
Did the wheels and axles come from Europe, or were those made in the United States?
The locomotives, that was all made here.
Including
But,
the wheels?
yes, it was just mainly, for some reason, when they rolled the rail, like in Chicago, there was the problem here, for some reason, we don't know, but the rail would crystallize over a short period of time. Locomotive number 25 on the V&T broke no less than 30 rails on its trip from Reno down to Carson City and up to Virginia City, and we kind of quietly got rid of that locomotive and had to go replace a lot of rail. Yes, ma'am.
The passengers were, when did you first start taking passengers on the CNC?
Well, that would have been let's see, November, December, about December of 1880 when the first excursion came down through Dayton. And
You always took passengers on the CSK.
yes, cost was 10 cents a mile.
That was my next question. Who was your typical passenger?
We had a wide variety. Miners, prospectors, everybody. You would have...
Start with a pros.
I have the right to remain silent on that question, my dear. No, they did have clergy. If there were a bunch of men, for example, the brakeman and conductor might engage them in cards on the trip up. Of course, lady passengers were pretty much left alone. There was this one instance where lady was pregnant. She notified the conductor, and the conductor said, "Madam, you should have informed me of your condition before you got on board." Her response was, "Sir, I was not in this condition before I got on board." Yes, ma'am.
What became of your children? They inherited a lot of money.
They spread out and, well, for an example, all the boys, they started as clerks in the railroad, worked their way up. Son James was assistant to the Treasurer of the United States. Edward and Hume involved in several interests like myself. Many of the companies that I had, they were passed down to them and their grandchildren. There's a...
The town that is now named after you. What was your connection with the copper mine there, or?
The town of Yerington. How did it get its name, you ask? Originally, the name of the town was called Pison Switch. And when we were doing our surveys, the people wanted the railroad to come there, and so they changed the name to Yerington in my honor, hoping I would be impressed and that I would run the railroad down there. Obviously, I wasn't impressed enough, because although the name was good, we were after business, which translates into money. And at the time, we didn't see any money down in Yerington, Nevada. It would be some 30 years before the Nevada Copper Belt Railroad would be built from Wabasca down there.
Do you remember the name of your depot manager here in Dayton?
Which one? There were several over the years.
Early on, the earliest one.
You'll have to forgive me. At 180 years old, there's two things that go. First is your memory,